right, so let's see. We could talk about, let's see, what was it? Healthcare. What was the other thing I said? UBI and immigration?
Immigration, yeah.
Okay, so let me touch base with because I'm trying to remember your position on, say, universal healthcare specifically. Were you for universal healthcare or against it? And by universal healthcare, I don't specifically mean Medicare for all. I'm including the hybrid systems like France and Germany have and all that.
Right. So I would say that I would prefer a more free market system. So anything in the direction of alleviating free market system, and basically the idea is to increase access through different measures. I'm more skeptical towards single payer for various, or just any sort of universal healthcare program for various reasons, and we can kind of discuss some of them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the main gist of it.
Okay, so are you saying you lean in the direction away from Germany/France style hybrid, or okay? See, for me, the whole point of the universal system is that everybody is covered, and so it takes into account that at some point in time, everyone's going to get sick, whether they want to think about that now or not. Mm-hmm. And so, I think it was, I can't remember, it was probably 10 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that. Ron Paul was running for president, and basically he was being interviewed by someone, and they're like, but what if someone gets sick and they didn't have insurance? And I can't remember exactly how the questions and stuff went down. I could probably find the video. But anyway, he's basically, they backed him up into the corner until the point where he's like, well, guess they're going to have to be left to die, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of the issue with that, I think, is also just understanding the framework of healthcare that the U.S. works under right now, and it's that it's a necessity for one to have insurance.
Yeah,
and part of the reason why is because there's so many various costs that have risen over the past 100 years or so, and I think so. My main issue isn't with those we need to so a lot of times conservatives within Congress will try to advocate for more competition, right, amongst insurance companies. Oh, you should deregulate state lines so they compete across, so you can have more insurance companies to drive down the cost. I actually don't think that goes far enough, because I think it's only you're only hitting the tip of the iceberg in a sense. Right. You're really trying to prune the leaves or the root problem in there. And I think part of the root problem is that there are various different regulations, but also just the way that the markets have structured themselves, that I think, and the markets structuring themselves meaning that it's been a reaction, right? When government does one thing, the markets will adapt and react to that, right? Because the markets are very, very, very adaptive in that sense, or maladaptive in one sense, right? That it will adapt for one area where it preserves a certain part of maybe.
Right. It'll react, but it'll react in a bad way at making it worse. Right.
They'll preserve them profit margins or something around those lines, and then in one sense, it makes the consumers worse off. So some of those things do happen. And so I think the focus for me, and I think what concerns me the most, is how do we cut that off, right? How do we lower the real cost of healthcare instead of limiting or making it more affordable? So I think I would say that my approach is a bit more different in that I think I want to actually reduce the real cost of healthcare, where a lot of the policies and candidates right now are trying to take care of the current problem. So I think that this is mainly A, philosophical, but also B, partly about economic policy that isn't really focused in the present in that one sense. Mm-hmm. So and obviously there's different political feasibility questions with that. I do think though there are some things that can be done even now that can lower the cost of healthcare. So some very, very easy examples that I could think of is making immigration a lot easier and changing. This isn't really necessarily easy, but changing some of the requirements for how for immigration, especially high skilled immigration. One of the biggest issues with doctors, with just medical healthcare in general, is that there's consistent shortage of doctors, and that's not by accident. It's not because it's not because the profession is just so prestigious and no one goes in there, but it's that there are real barriers that have been purposefully set up for various intentions, either for good intentions or for bad intentions, that have made it harder for people to qualify.
Right. And this isn't my area of expertise, so tell me if I'm wrong or not. But one of the things that I was listening to on a podcast where they were mentioning that some of the regulations on procedures that, let's say, the difference between like a doctor or a RN or all these other people, that some procedures that could be done well by someone like an RN or, an assistant of some sort, they only let doctors do those procedures. And that inflates the costs because obviously doctors are going to cost more than those people.
Not just that, too. There's all sorts of different things that nurses can't do that have to be reserved to doctors, such as prescribing certain medication. And it's true that nurses receive a lesser education, but if you actually look and you talk to doctors and you go to hospitals to see how it works, nurses are incredibly important. Like, that. And there's consistent stories of nurses, including, one of my old mentors, who berated doctors for making mistakes, for not doing a procedure well, for not administering a drug properly. There's a lot of tacit knowledge in how to actually apply certain things that nurses do know. And there are certain procedures that maybe even nurses have been so experienced in this field of working so much in a system that they could actually do it themselves. That could actually reduce the cost straight up with that. But there are legal barriers with that make it harder for those things.
Right.
I think part of the issue here is also that.
So just to double check, so we both agree that they should do a little bit of deregulation in that area, not necessarily not necessarily eliminating the regulation, but easing it at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that also is that when you raise the barrier of entry, less people are going to get in, and it creates a chokehold of supply. And this is exactly what's happened with the medical profession. And I mean, like this, it's not just that this has been happening for the past 20, 30, 40 years. This has been going on since the 1700s, when some of the earliest physicians at that time had started to call for a more stringent academic or more stringent control on how doctors are educated. And it was for good reasons. Like, I'm not saying that it's wrong. And it's that you want to have higher quality healthcare providers because you're playing with people's lives, right?
Right, exactly. Which is my... sorry if I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say you should make the requirements sufficiently, stringent in order to keep people safe, but not so stringent to where you're just going overboard. Like an analogy might be like the airline industry, as far as like the freakouts from terrorism. Like most of the stuff that you have to go through in order to get into the airport and get onto the airline isn't actually making anyone safer. All it's doing is driving up costs and making people have to wait longer and stuff like that. And so there's obviously a diminishing point of return. And like with, safety on airlines, it seems like we've gone well past that as far as healthcare goes too.
Yeah. And those were for good intentions, but I think the steps that were taken, which was essentially licensing and further steps of licensing, really, I don't know if that was the right step of the direction. And I'm still even now skeptical about that for various reasons. For medical licenses, as it's basically like currency, right? It's almost like being in New York and you have those golden taxi medallions, because those don't get made anymore. But when you have that, you're allowed to be a legal taxi. Anything else that doesn't have that, that's a black market right there.
Right,
so there's all these various issues that come about with that. And it really hits that spike. It really starts to climax and escalate around the 1900s, when medical care becomes more professionalized due to various scientific advances that have been made.
Right.
And obviously, I think with certain free marketers, they would point to World War II as being one of the first catalysts of essentially artificially inflating healthcare costs for various reasons. And one of the things that started happening was essentially employer-provided insurance with that. And there are a whole host of issues that came with that, along with, at that time, the formation of Blue Cross Blue Shield that came about. And they were essentially contracting almost pseudo monopolies in the health market, and all of those things essentially helped raise the cost. And then came Medicare, Medicaid, and it's not to say that none of these policies are evil or awful, but it's just that there are trade-offs that were made, and I think the electorate, or at least the government, deemed those trade-offs to be worth it in the short run, and it seems to be the case that they certainly were. But in the long run, I think there have been a lot of problems that have slowly started to catch up with us on that. That I do think there should be some necessary steps to be taken for that. I think also that, when we talk about implementing healthcare like the NHS from Britain or France's healthcare or Germany's healthcare or Sweden's healthcare, and it's like not even like talking about the question of feasibility, right? We're talking about the question of how would it work in America. I think for me, especially coming from an Asian background, there is a particular culture in America that is very, very different from European culture, right? And that permeates in lifestyle, right? And I think part of that too is that it's not just an issue of health, but also like healthcare, but also public health in general, right? The foods that we consume, the things that are made that are put in, the high amounts of sugar, the high amounts of carbohydrates, and the toleration of the American public for wanting to have these types of high sugary content products do lead to further health problems that can compound upon themselves and create a lot of different costs. Right. And so if one is to implement any sort of universal healthcare, and I think from my understanding, I think Britain's healthcare system will be a bit more problematic. I think Germany's healthcare system will probably be the best copy and paste model if you're going to try to actually put it into the framework of America. That'll probably be the best one.
Germany seems to be doing everything better than everyone else right now.
Right. And well, with the exception of Taiwan and Japan and Sweden, but Taiwan, Japan, and Sweden, there's a lot of variation in how those countries are run and based on just different statistics of population and different things that essentially I don't think makes it possible in America for various different reasons.
I'm usually looking at the bigger countries that are the most comparable to America. Obviously, France is a completely different language, completely different culture, but there's more in the same realm of comparing to America rather than Taiwan or something like that. Not only is France massively more populous, and so, it kind of attacks that part of the equation, but it's also, it's a more similar culture. Two of the things I was going to mention before I forget about them. So as far as I can tell, making the universal part of universal healthcare, you either have to have a universal mandate where everyone has to get healthcare, or you simply build that into the Medicare system in America. Anybody who doesn't have healthcare through their employer or some other means is automatically covered by Medicare through taxes and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And so personally, I'd prefer the latter. I think that's one of the problems with Obamacare is it is kind of burdensome having to figure out how to maneuver your way into getting healthcare if you don't already get it with your employer. But with having just Medicare that automatically covers anyone who doesn't already have healthcare, it seems to me that would be the more efficient way to implement the universal aspect of healthcare in America. Not, again, because that's my whole point, is I'm not trying to get rid of, public option or private options for healthcare. Mm-hmm. I just want to make sure everyone is covered to a certain level, no matter who you are, no matter anything else like that.
So part of the issue with maintaining a private option is that eventually there will be a time of people opting out, and this has occurred in other countries beforehand, where even Taiwan, where when they were coming up with a healthcare system plan, they essentially decided that no, you can't opt out. And that's, I think, to me, having a private system of healthcare within America, along with a universal healthcare system, I'm not sure how that would turn out for various.
How have you? Again, I haven't. Or again, you probably studied certain aspects of this more than I have. Are you familiar with how Germany and France have dealt with that? Because again, they have both public and private aspects of their healthcare system. Everyone who doesn't get healthcare through their employer or some other means is automatically covered by the government, right?
So I don't recall how Germany dealt with it. I remember reading this beforehand, so my memory's a bit short on that. But if I remember correctly with Germany, and probably someone, if anyone listens to this, will probably correct me on this because this is where I do not remember. But I think, I'm not sure if the private opting out remains an issue right now, but one of the issues that you can mitigate with that, I can't recall.
Of course, Germany is the most populous country in Western Europe, and so to me, that would lead more credence to why their version would probably be the best one. Like you said, if we were going to copy and paste something to America, that their again, more similar culture, not identical, obviously, but more similar, more populous, more alike in a lot of the same ways. But want to finish off our final remarks on healthcare and move on to, what were we going to do, UBI?
Yeah. So I think one thing also with Germany is that if you're going to implement a universal healthcare system in that sense, it's going to have to trickle down to the healthcare education too. I think one thing that's very obvious is that compensation with doctors in Germany and various European countries are significantly lower than American doctors.
Right.
And I would actually go further and say, like, even in a free market, American doctors are objectively overpaid.
Right.
And it's not because, they don't deserve the pay or any of that sort, but it's because the education that brings the way that we've formatted our healthcare education for doctors and for healthcare providers is immensely costly.
Right. It's extremely, extremely difficult or expensive to get a doctorate.
Yeah. And it's just not,
an MD.
It's just not reasonable. And so if one was to, and so like for me who leans towards a free market system, that would be one of the first things to go is how can we format the education that can lessen the trade-offs of this, that can decrease the cost of healthcare providers, but also provide ample education. Because at some point, right, and it's not that the quality doesn't matter, but it's that at some point when you raise the quality, there comes with diminishing marginal utility, right? There comes with diminishing marginal benefits.
The law of diminishing return.
Right, and now the marginal costs will exceed the benefits that are being gained from that. And I do think we are at a point where it seems like the benefits of all the education that we pour into these doctors with immense human capital that come out with these immense skills, I do think that the benefits are essentially outweighed by the costs. And I think a solution for that would be to have additional specialization and additional separation in different branches of healthcare and different tasks that would essentially, divide that labor and essentially make the process a lot cheaper. But that remains to be seen. There's a lot of barriers with that. I mean, the AMA does not want that whatsoever. There's a vision of them.
Wait, say that again, last part again?
The AMA. The American
okay.
Yeah.
I thought you said Andrew Yang there for a minute. I was like,
no.
I don't remember that.
The AMA will probably not be for this for various political reasons. There's a lot of issues with, that would cause an erosion of the prestige of being a doctor. But I think,
right, exactly. And being in it for the prestige shouldn't be the reason that you're being a doctor in the first place. It should be to help people while earning a reasonable income. But
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So we can move on to the next topic then, UBI. So I don't know how much you have studied it or how much, and of course every implementation is different because Andrew Yang's freedom dividend is not the same as Milton Friedman's not quite so universal, but basically a similar, the negative income tax, negative tax return.
Negative income tax. Yeah.
So what's your opinion on, on UBI?
So I'm a lot more ambivalent about UBI. I think Yang's proposal was a lot more reasonable in that he was essentially doing, like, if you want to keep your benefits, then you won't get the UBI. But if you want to have the UBI, well, then you have to exchange that for the benefits that you receive.
Right, exactly. And in most cases, he said that the UBI is going to be more than the benefits they're getting. And so that's going to, take out a large portion of the people on welfare. And so there's doesn't need to be nearly as much of a bureaucracy for just mailing checks out to people compared to, having to verify whether someone's income is this high so that they can get this amount of food stamps or, something to that effect. So replacing a lot of that with Andrew Yang's version of the UBI seems pretty beneficial.
Yeah. And that is definitely something that I'm, if cutting off welfare and exchanging that with a universal basic income, I think that would actually be a better proposal. And I think part of the reason why is because you're just giving you're directly giving the cash, right? You're not going through and organizing all these ridiculous bureaucratic networks of benefits of how these things would be received, right? Where you have these food stamps, where you have these different things, and you have to go to different avenues to actually receive those benefits. But instead, you give them straight cash, right? And just per regular economic assumptions is that human beings are rational and that, Poor people.
Well,
Poor.
that's where my psychology background would disagree with that humans are basically rational, or the rationality that economics professors are thinking of is a different rationality than psychology, because in psychology there's a whole laundry list of cognitive errors and biases that cause people to make the wrong decisions, and just the fact that humans very much, they're focused on the near-term immediate goals more so than long-term stuff that could happen. They're like, well, I could think about that, but I don't want to worry about that now. And so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's kind of where the psychology background would differ from the economics one, I suppose.
Right, and I guess it depends regarding the long-term, short-term discussion. I think that would be a very fascinating discussion for the future. But I think regardless of that, as per the economic assumption that people seek to maximize their utility or maximize their gains with the cash that they have, I think we have better reason to trust people who receive universal basic income to use it well, to use it to their needs. Right.
Oh, and to double check what you said that you'd prefer them get rid of all welfare altogether and just have the UBI cover all that, which
right, and increase,
which would differ from Andrew Yang's proposal.
Right, and that's where I differ with that. And you can also increase the income to match in proportion with the welfare, because even in that sense, because it's about feasibility, right? I think it's a lot more feasible for one to say, let's just convert the entire welfare system into just cash and liquidate it and just give people liquid cash, versus saying just get rid of welfare in general and just and that's it, right? But so I think that would be a more reasonable approach versus any other. If there are libertarians who support this, I would say that this would probably be a better approach or more optimistic approach. I think I would say that would be better, and maintaining current budget expenditures. I would say that money better well spent than the current welfare system with all sorts of different inefficiencies. I mean, there's a lot of studies that's been done on this that shows that really, whenever welfare benefits trickle down from the treasury or from the government through the bureaucratic network down to the recipient, that they only get a very, very small fraction of that. I don't exactly remember the amount, but they don't even get the full dollar. They don't even get half the dollar, if I remember correctly. They just don't get that much, and that just seems to me to be wrong, right? I mean, basic intuition tells me that that's wrong, and that this system should be made to be more efficient, where you get rid of all these different intermediaries and you just hand out that cash, which I think is would be much better, and it also would cut off a lot of waste. Right. I think one thing that I'm still studying and still looking at is the benefits of UBI, because there's a lot to be promised and there's a lot of potential with UBI program, but from my understanding, establishing the causal effects of the benefits and establishing the various policies and ways in which the UBI benefits could trickle down, that seems to be a topic that's still being studied intensely.
Right. I think it's fairly reasonable to say that if everybody got $1,000 on top of what they're getting right now, mental health is going to improve because simply financial stress is going to alleviate to some degree.
Right, and that could be a benefit, but my concern is more about the long-term benefits of that, which to me that remains to be unknown. But I do know that there are some very, very some vocal advocates for UBI amongst the libertarian free market circles.
Right, which is one of the reasons why I thought it was so interesting, because there are a lot of people who are... Andrew Yang is very clearly on the left. I know that he's center-left for sure, but I know that there will probably be a million comments in the comments section of people saying Andrew Yang's a right-wing neoliberal or something like that. But anyway, that's exactly one of the things that that I found interesting about the UBI is that both people on the left and right seem to, be given it a pretty good, consideration. And I don't know if you're familiar with them, the Neoliberal Podcast. I know the word neoliberal, again, may set a bunch of people off. By neoliberal, I'm not talking about complete laissez-faire, free market individuals. And by the Neoliberal Podcast are people that, certainly from the U.S.'s perspective, are on the left. They're a part of I can't remember the Progressive something institute. But anyway,
Progressive too.
I think the progressive, yeah, man, it just slips my mind right at the moment. But they're one of the things that the host of that podcast likes to say is he's not necessarily pro UBI, but he's UBI curious.
Right. And I would consider myself in that category. But I am somewhat ambivalent about it in that I don't feel very strongly about it for various reasons. But I do have preferences as to how it would be implemented. And I think like I said before, just exchanging those benefits and just turning them into straight cash would be such a, really that would be much more efficient by a long shot.
Right. And of course, at least, again, Andrew Yang's version, it seems like he has a pretty good idea of how to pay for it. The amount that it would take over from the welfare bureaucracy and welfare payouts and stuff would, I think, was $600 or $800 million. And then there's several other. There was another. I'd have to double check the article that I read, but it was another $800 million through another way. And so basically, the net cost of it, rather than being like $3 trillion or something like that, was only going to be $1.4 trillion. And then just implementing the VAT tax would basically take care of that, and actually probably like more than take care of it. And, the response for a lot of the people on the left would be that consumption tax like that disproportionately affect the poor, which is true. But that's why the whole point of this isn't just to introduce a consumption tax. There would be a significant net benefit when combining it with the UBI, because people are still going to be getting much more money than they're going to be spending extra on the things. And Andrew Yang pointed out that you can easily just make items that the poorest of society uses more often exempt, like diapers or toilet paper or, various things like that. And so it could still be tailored even in that way. And so that's what I liked about it, is it seemed like he had a pretty good idea of how to pay for the UBI.
Yeah. And I when he was still running for president, I consider him to be the best candidate out of all the candidates that are running. I would essentially hold him and Joe Jorgensen as essentially like my top two candidates. But unfortunately, the Democratic establishment decided to pick
Joe Biden, which, to be fair, is better than Donald Trump. But Joe Biden was somewhere like, I don't even think he was in the top 5 of the Democrats that I was interested in.
Yeah, but being better than Donald Trump is a very, very low bar to pass.
Oh yeah. Again, I can already see the comments stacking up in the comments section.
And let's not even mention about the whole sexual assault accusations with Joe Biden. And part of my frustration was like a lot of the people on the left just, not a lot, I don't know how many, but like there were, New York Times came out with an op-ed and they were like, I believe in Tara Reade, the accuser of Joe Biden on sexual assault, but I'm still going to vote for him. And I was like, okay, there seems to be some hypocrisy going on here regarding the previous election with Donald Trump when he was straight up, accused of sexual assault.
Right, absolutely.
It just seems to me that it's such a lack of principles and it's such, and yes, every single criticism that I'm going to be putting out against people regarding, against Biden supporters regarding this issue, I would also just turn. I didn't vote for Trump. I was too young to vote for Trump actually, but even if I was old enough, I would not have voted for him, and that remains to be the case now, right? But like that cuts both ways too.
One of the things is it's not that necessarily you're supposed to believe guilty until proven innocent. It's just that it seems like the Democrats assume Joe Biden's innocence before seeing any of the evidence. And then with Trump, it was the opposite. And in both cases, an accusation should be taken seriously and not automatically dismissed or accepted. It should just simply be taken seriously and investigated. And it shouldn't have to do with what party someone is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, how are they going to handle this whole case with Tara Reade accusing him? I don't know. But there was some irony sprinkled when certain lefties were very, very skeptical about the whole sexual assault accusation against Biden, when essentially this was the exact same attitude the conservatives had when Trump was being accused multiple times and Kavanaugh was being accused multiple times, where they would say stuff like, "This is just perfect timing."
Right.
she was just, I mean, they're just being dishonest. I mean,
Right.
it reeks of, I mean, and the less behavior right now, it reeks of Gloria Steinem whenever she essentially threw Monica Lewinsky under the bus to defend Clinton. Because, you know, for her, for what principles to be grounded on feminist ideals, there's just a lot of irony in that. And you know, I find that to be just quite like ethics. I mean, just in terms of principles and just in terms of ethics, to be pretty disgraceful.
Right. From my perspective, the thing that I would say was at least slightly different with Joe Biden is that the accusation is a pretty, like a description of the situation, like him, what was it, leaping onto someone in the elevator and, you know, just getting very explicit. Yeah. And so the reason I would say it's at least slightly different from the Trump thing is that is unlike almost any other. There's not a history of doing stuff to that level as far as Joe Biden there goes. There's you know, the kind of creeper like sniffing people and stuff like that, but there's nothing that rises to that level. Whereas with Trump, a lot of the accusations against him were perfectly in his history of behavior.
I mean, it's funny because back when I used to, and this was a long time ago, but back when I used to actually follow the Daily Wire, you know, the Ben Shapiro.
Oh yeah.
Before they jumped onto the Trump train, they actually published an article where they just recalled all of Trump's dirt. And I mean, Ben Shapiro wrote it. I think he wrote it, but he basically like recalled the incident where Trump was accused of raping his first wife, Ivana Trump. I mean, this stuff is not new. It's just
right. And exactly. So there's a whole history of it, or a history of such accusations with Trump.
Yeah, and so that, to me, is just beyond. I mean, the state of American politics is truly where it's at because, quote unquote, we the people really deserve it. Because people, I mean, the American electorate chose these people, elected these people, and because of that, they suffer for those consequences. And I mean,
right. That's one of the things that kind of irks me is everyone blames the two parties, and I'm like, then why don't you vote for somebody else? Because the fact of the matter is the DNC is going to have its favorites, and so is the RNC, and they're gonna push money to try, you know, advertise and all this other sort of stuff. But when it comes down to it, they're not getting in there unless they get votes, and so it just, I don't know, plays to the gullibility of the masses, while also that they want something. They'll complain about the two parties, and yet they'll stick to those two parties with an iron grip. And it kind of reminds me of like an 89% reelection rate for members of Congress, and yet something like a 12% approval rating, or maybe like 20%. But in any case, everyone thinks that Congress is terrible, and yet everyone reelects the same congressman.
And once you start questioning these assumptions about, well, why do you have to keep voting for them? That's for the status quo. That's when they start making the same ridiculous, nonsensical arguments for why they have to maintain the current electorate, for why this person's the best option and this whatever. And I mean, yeah, to me, it's just the political scene of America is utterly pathetic.
Right.
They deserve it. The American electorate deserves it for this.
Yeah, I agree. Well, shall we move on to immigration?
Yeah.
All right. So give me your perspective on immigration.
Open borders.
Oh, okay. That's where it is. Of course, that's another one of the interesting crossroads where people pretty far to the left often agree with the libertarians who are still firmly on the right. Mm-hmm. Personally, you said open borders, correct?
Yep.
Which isn't no borders, which is one of the first things that people start to conflate knowingly or unknowingly about it. It's not no borders. I'm assuming you're in favor of everyone who crosses the border still needs to be, you know, tallied up and accounted for and given a identification number or however they do that sort of stuff, correct?
Right.
Right. So that's simple common sense stuff. I don't have a firm position other than that borders are not nearly open enough. I'm not sure where I would be at on a fully open border. I may completely agree with it, but I can potentially see a level of, it's possible that there could be a level of immigration at which it overwhelms the ability to keep track of, to some degree, culture. And by culture, I don't mean like it in the right-wing sense and like trying to preserve some specific religion or something like that. I'm just talking about like, you have to believe in freedom of religion, or you should believe in freedom of religion if you're here. And if you get too many people who don't believe in freedom of religion, again, I don't think that's the case. I don't think we've ever come close to having a flood that big, and I don't think a flood that big would happen. I'm just basically trying to play devil's advocate, in which I can see a situation in which that could be the case, and in which completely open borders may be not necessarily the thing with the best consequence. But I'm certainly I'm very open to the idea of open borders.
Yeah. At least I'm playing devil's racist, because there's a lot of, I mean, really the struggle, I mean, and especially within the libertarian circles, the debates on immigration is always very, very heated for various reasons.
Right,
and,
because a lot of libertarians are just Republicans who are calling themselves libertarians.
obviously, like, you kind of know my political viewpoints on that. So I would be considered an extreme libertarian. Considered to be an analytical anarchist of that sort. And amongst those, there's still a lot of hard debate on immigration, particularly with understanding how to deal with, since the state exists, how are you going to deal with the borders, right? But I think the answer should continually, decisively be. Sorry, that was a notification, but
that's all right.
I think it should be decisively open borders. I think it should continue to be open borders for various reasons.
Economically, go ahead.
Not just economically, but I think mirroring some of the stuff that you talked about with climate change, like it seems to me that the social scientific literature on this is pretty overwhelming. The evidence for immigration benefiting, having a net benefit, is really, really hard to overturn. And
most people do assimilate by at least the second generation, if not the third. And so the idea that America is going to stop being America doesn't make much sense.
Right, it's nonsensical, right? And the economic benefits are just all. So when you talk about like fiscal benefits, like, what about the burden on the public budget system, right? The public finance system, is that based on all the studies that's been done, it seems that there's evidence pointing towards that on a federal level, on a national level, immigrants would actually be a net benefit. They'd be a net benefit for public finance, but the benefit is negligible. So
especially with stuff like Social Security, or of course, I want to buy open borders and stuff like that. The whole point is to make it so that they're considered legal, and so they would, in this scenario, be paying tax. But especially right now, illegal immigrants are generally paying taxes in a lot of cases, and I can't remember, it's to the tune of several billion per year. And so that is actually helping keep Social Security afloat, which has been drained for various stupid reasons over the decades. But and that's one of the things I heard about from some libertarians to oppose open borders based on the economics perspective, is they were like, well, if they're officially legal, now they do get to draw from Social Security. I'm like, yeah, but they're also still now paying more Social Security tax, or they're on average, all of them are paying Social Security tax right now. It's just the fact that they're going to be younger, and they're not going to be people that are retiring anytime soon for the most part, that are coming over. And so even if they're eventually going to draw on Social Security, they're still helping us right now.
And I think for libertarians, and I think for just people who object to open borders by saying, well, it could overwhelm the welfare state, or it could overwhelm Social Security, I think there's an immense lack of imagination there, because there are various policies there are various policies that we can adapt to those circumstances. And
they're going to be paying sales tax. It's not like immigrants are exempt from sales tax. They're going to be paying income tax and all that other sort of, all those other sort of things. Right.
And it's not like economists haven't come up with these different solutions. It's just that people don't listen to them. Right. Like, they're really, really, really like just straightforward solution would just be, well, why don't you just put up visas for sale, right? You allow people to purchase visas, and you put a limited amount. I mean, you put out like you raise the visa cap by 100 to 200, 300,000, and you have people buy it, right? That essentially is that goes to, I mean, that all those benefits go to the government, right? They get to keep that money for various, whatever they want to do with that. But not to mention that if people were to buy these Social Security, and not Social Security, but there ends up being a self-selection effect with the people who are able to afford it, which means these people tend to be more decently well off, which means they tend to be higher skilled. Well, what does that mean? If you're higher skilled, you're going to earn more money. And when you earn more money, you're going to end up paying more taxes. Now, some egalitarians and some people may object to this by saying, well, this is just discriminating against the poor. And I would agree, right? That's just one of the many, many solutions that you can essentially divide into different stratas of how you want to deal with certain immigration, that you can say, oh, well, instead of having these licensing, right, like what I mentioned before, with healthcare licensing, like medical license and different high-skilled licenses that one has to obtain, that instead of having these stringent regulations that prevent other high-skilled laborers from coming in, that you can essentially allow them to come in with just buying with visas, but you have a different policy or different system with lower skilled immigrants. One of the biggest issues is that when people say open borders, they just imagine like these hordes of low skilled Mexican workers.
Right, because
brand, it's ridiculous for so many different reasons, not just like philosophically, but also ethically, but also just empirically. It's just not true.
Yeah, because they don't all stay here. Just like before the 1960s legislation that kind of started this problem in the first place, they would come to America to work. They'd work and then they'd go back across the border home. And half the problem now is that since they know that it's so hard to get across the border, they stay rather than going back and forth.
Exactly. Right. And so thinking about open borders isn't just about low-skilled immigrants coming in, right? And it's really ironic because I remember there was a Ted Cruz ad that was on Texas.
Ironic.
But this was during the 2016 election, and it was about immigration. And he showed these well-dressed men and women with suits and luggages and suitcases just hopping across the river, and then you just hear Ted Cruz's monologue. And it was like, if these immigrants are coming, were journalists or were doctors or were lawyers, they would immediately go and try to restrict these types of things. That was his whole thing, and it's like, yeah, you're right. So and guess what? It's because they are. It's because they are restricted in the first place. So open the borders up for the high-skilled workers to come. Open them up because they will be the main contributors for, various taxes. But I don't even think like taxes should matter. Like to me, that just seems to be, again, like I said beforehand, like it's a federal, it tends to be a federal net positive in terms of at the federal level, but at the state and local government, it tends to be a net negative. But the immigrants' net negative contributions are still negligible.
Right, exactly. They're technically a net negative, but not by enough of a margin to where it overwhelms the other benefits.
Right, and it's just like, it doesn't make sense. I think one way to think about this is that when immigrants come across, even though they're low-skilled, right, and public resources are poured into them with roads or schools, whatever other nonsense that try to amplify the costs, right, these are still initial investments of human capital. And once the second generation comes, they tend to be higher skilled and they tend to be more assimilated into the American population. Like these things don't just stay permanently. Like these people don't just stay to be like they don't remain to be a permanent drag on.
Right, exactly. Otherwise, like America would have never recovered from the multiple massive surges of immigration, the 1840s, 1880s, 10s, 20s. Like we would have never recovered, and in reality, we only got stronger and stronger every time.
Exactly. And it's because immigrants are overall always beneficial to the economy, almost always beneficial. The most skeptical, first of all, if people are to go against the grain on this, against the socio-scientific literature on this, the only respectable scholar that is in the economic literature on this, that is deep within the economic literature, and is an immigration skeptic, is George Borjas. He's a conservative, and he does not like immigration. He doesn't like immigration. He prefers less immigration. But his own studies and his own empirical work show that immigration tends to be a net benefit. And even if they are a net loss, it's a short-term loss that is mitigated in the long term, right? His most famous study that he did was the Marriott boat lift, when, when Castro decided to release a bunch of Cubans into Florida, there was according to his study like a 17% decrease in wages for low skilled non-high school graduates. Low skilled non-high school graduates 17%, and that was in a short run. And even at that point, a lot of the economists that read the study questioned his assumptions and how he categorized how he had 4 different strata of low skilled high school graduate, low skilled high school dropout, and a high school college graduate, and like another category. And it was like, well, why don't you just do 2 categories, high school and college? Because that's the standard way of measuring it. And when you did the standard way of measuring the wage impacts, there was no cost. There was no decrease in that. And if there was any decrease in terms of repeating the studies, it was essentially negligible in the short run. It just made little to no difference. And so like really the arguments, like when you read Heritage who are on immigration, I mean, I don't even think Heritage is that Heritage has a lot of problems, but the Heritage, the econ research in Heritage is actually still top notch. That's just from me knowing some of the people that work in DC that are libertarian and conservative and work in the economic circles, and that's why they're so respected in one sense. But I mean, unless you're going to talk about like a lot of those organizations that come up with this information about how immigrants are a drag on the U.S. economy, they're kind of irrelevant. Like they just don't have the credentials, they don't have the data, and there's the burden of proof is on them. They need to show how it's a cost, and they need to have overwhelming support. Right, a lot of conservatives have this habit of just citing one study from freaking.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's one of the things that drives me the most crazy in any sort of subject that has anything to do with science or studies. Is I'm like, you don't take one study. You take the convergence of evidence. You look for meta-analyses. You don't just pick a handful, and you also need to have real peer-reviewed journals and stuff like that. It's not those made-up pay-to-play ones.
They do the exact same thing with immigration and crime. I remember there was a brief video of, I don't know if you know him, Michael Knowles. He also works at Daily Wire. He's like a Catholic conservative.
Not familiar right off the bat.
Yeah, he gave a talk at a university, and he was like talking about how illegal immigrants commit more crimes. And this professor questioned him, and this poor professor, this lady she's not immersed in the immigration literature, but he reiterated that he cited federal studies that show that immigrants committed more crimes, as if there aren't any problems with federal studies. And it's like, again, in terms of crime, which we're now going beyond the realm of economics, the socio-scientific literature is still overwhelmingly on the side of immigrants, that they commit less crimes.
Right. Because I researched the specific thing as far as Germany goes, because one of the conservative talking points is, look at Germany and France. They're getting Sharia law zones, and they've got crime skyrocketing with all this, flood of immigrants coming in. And I looked into this stuff, and I'm like, no, their crime rate is actually increasing at a much slower rate than the amount of immigrants that are coming in, which means that immigrants are actually committing less crimes than local-born people. And of course, all those countries have lower crime rate than America anyway.
And even then, it's just not a good case. It's not a good argument against open borders. So when conservatives say the mass Syrian refugee crisis showed that open borders don't work, it's like, no, it doesn't. Why do you think? What is the difference between Syrian refugees and Mexican immigrants?
It's like, what are you looking at? Because I've seen this stuff and it didn't say that.
Syrian refugee and Mexican immigrant or Chinese immigrant. Syrian refugees fled. They fled from Syria. Why? Because America's been bombing Syria. Because there's a civil war going on in Syria. And so guess what? They fled. And they're forced to flee because they don't want to die. This is just basic elementary distinction of categories that it flies over. It just flies over their head on that. And it's just, no, it's not true that this is a case of how open borders would work. It's actually not. It's the opposite. It's what happens when you have awful foreign policy that creates blowback, right? It creates blowback and causes these various issues that trickles back to the original countries that intervened. Right.
Their position on this is, like in a lot of areas, they're not actually concerned with where the best evidence points. They're they have a value system behind this. They're trying to they don't like foreigners is basically what it is, and so they're trying to think of whatever they can to justify not liking foreigners. Or there's a lot of situations in which everybody does it, obviously left and right, but I can offhand think of a lot of right-wing situations. For example, sex education in schools. There's a big, robust amount of evidence showing that abstinence-only school districts, or districts that teach abstinence-only sex education, have way higher rates of STD transmission and teen pregnancy than the school districts that teach comprehensive sex education. And so there is overwhelming evidence for this. Like, we pretty much know this for a fact, but because those on the far right have a value that they're trying to preserve, and a bad value. They're puritanical, terrified of sex, and so they want to force a policy that we know against all evidence is not a good policy, because they have an emotional attachment to the issue rather than a consequentialist version, rather than you're like, okay, well, whether I want this to be the case or not, what is the case, and what's the best thing that we can do to get to the best outcome? And for people like me, the best outcome is fewer teen pregnancies and fewer STDs. For them, STDs are the natural consequence of engaging in sexual immorality.
Right. It's obviously ridiculous. You know, as a Christian, obviously, like, it's not preferable, right? It's just not. It doesn't work. And I mean, there's all sorts of issues in how conservative Christians try to implement, you know, biblical morality into law. There's all sorts of problems that I've talked about with them, right? Like, prostitution is one of the things that I think legalizing it, or not legalizing it, decriminalizing it, because frankly, I don't like government legalizing things because it just gives them more credit to tax and regulate it. I mean, you already know my political disposition on it, but decriminalizing these things is much more preferable for various reasons, right? And I mean, there are certain ethics where, like, even if these things are wrong from a certain perspective or certain moral viewpoint, the issue I have is, does that grant you necessity to then regulate and to stop it?
Right. They're like, I don't want you to do that, therefore I'm going to make laws as if people aren't going to do that. And rather than, I'm not going to do that, but I recognize that people are going to do this whether I want them to or not, and so I better create laws from that perspective.
So it's like, obviously there still is a leap, whether or not the Christian is right, there still is a leap from normative ethics into actual policy, and that remains to be a continuing challenge. But even like going back to immigration and some of the crime stuff is like, when people like Michael Knowles would cite federal studies, and this is just like a quick breakdown of the data as to why citing federal studies is not a knockdown in terms of crime rates. The federal government enforces immigration law, and Border Patrol is directly funded by the government, right? And so because of that, federal prisons tend to have a higher population of illegal immigrants. That means that there is already a self-selection bias on here. Exactly. These illegal immigrants, well, lo and behold, if you go into a prison, you're going to find criminals. Right, it's just, this is a self-selection. This is not a random distribution. This is just not a proper way of studying it. But not just that. The federal prison population is less than 10% of the national prison population. The majority of prison populations are in states. Like, not only there's self-selection going on, but there's also different biases at play. There's different omitted variable biases at play, and I mean, straight up the bat, like, the sample size is already trash, right? So, like, people who cite federal studies, I mean, it's just not. There's too many problems with that for that to actually work, and that's part of the reason why people have continued to push for state prisons to study and release these data on policies. The only state that actually works with the federal government on this is Texas, and Alex Nowasta. That's
surprising.
Yeah, I mean, and Alex Nowasta and David Beer. From a Cato Institute did a comprehensive study, which I actually have the paper copy of the study. When I got to meet them last year. And that breaking down data shows how, guess what, legal and illegal immigrants commit more rates. The only state that we have that has a complete liberty to look at the immigration data shows that both legal and illegal immigrants commit lower rates of crime. which is not surprising because that's just always been the case. And like, again, looking at certain issues, it's like when people say, oh, well, if you open the borders, it's going to just flood, or it's going to flood just brown wave, right? It's so ridiculous with the time of fingers.
Yeah.
To no end, right?
That's the first time I've never heard brown wave before. That's
an invasion. Right? They say that with an invasion.
Oh yeah, invasion.
Caravan. And people are like,
all these mothers and 5-year-olds and people just trying to get a job, or they're invading.
And one of the things that's interesting is that when the Bracero program was still going on, which you kind of alluded to it when you said pre-1960s.
Yeah.
A lot of immigrant workers lived in Mexico, even though they worked in the U.S., because they just simply crossed the border by day and returned by night. What happens when you have an open border system is that there tends to be a cycle. There are cycles of exchange that happens across the border where people are incentivized to stay on the border. But what happens if you close the border, right? Conservatives now tend to think that our borders are too porous. In reality, based on the numbers, America has a closed border policy, a 90 to 95% closed border policy. And Alex Mawasa has repeated
your people, getting into America is like backed up 4 or 5, what is it? Just a huge amount of time in order to
wait for 100 years. The official time.
Yeah. Which is one of the funny things is because the anti-immigrant people are always like, I'm not against immigration. I'm against illegal immigration. I'm like, no, you're against immigration because you're not wanting to change the laws that would allow them to come here legally. Right. You're just against immigrants.
The whole the legal illegal immigration is a completely nonsensical distinction because legal is arbitrary. If today America decided to make only Christian immigrants legal and all other immigrants illegal, you can say the exact same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not against immigration. I'm against illegal immigration. Well, it turns out that the illegal category excludes every single person but Christian immigrants. That kind of makes it a moot point. Like it means nothing in its sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so, and also like with that is what happens when you close the border is that illegal immigrants that now become illegal all of a sudden, and now they're considered an invasion, right? When they continue to seek work because laws cannot correct market realities, right? And they still want to avoid enforcement and avoid capture. What ends up happening is they travel deeper into the states. And that's when you find immigrants deep in America, illegal immigrants deep in America, because that's the best way to avoid capture, right? These are just incentives that kind of lay themselves out. And this is just what happens. These are the unintended consequences of U.S. immigration policy. And the government continues to have the hubris to ignore these different various policy points and refuse to recognize that what they're essentially doing is very much akin to how the Soviet Union managed the economy. They're essentially planning the labor market. This is a socialistic planning of the labor market. Look at the long lines. Look at the long queues of visa.
I'd like to see
green Soviet Union policies, right? But a lot of conservatives just don't want to recognize it, and they try to justify that by saying, well, it goes beyond the economic one. It's like, well, so what if it does? All the other social-scientific literature shows that they are not a harm. And so, I've studied much more deep, much on a much deeper level,
right?
And I think it's one of the issues that is a lot easier to argue for. It's very, very hard for me to see a conservative argument.
Right. Exactly. And it's because there's a good portion of the left and the right that are for this, specifically the libertarian right. But, there's a decent amount of people on the right anyway. One of the other talking point or responses or critiques, I don't know what you'd call it, that I hear from people on the right is responding to how whenever undocumented, illegal, or whatever, however you call it, immigrant gets mistreated or thrown into prison or beat up, separated from their kids, etc. The response is, well, they're breaking the law. They think that that's a good excuse. I'm like, wait a minute. Stealing a pair of baseball cards from the store is also a breaking the law. Should they be separated from their children and thrown in prison or something? It's like they think that once they've defined it as breaking the law, it's automatically any punishment is there for fine. There's no concept of the punishment should be proportional to the crime. It just disappears for them because a brown person has committed a crime, and so any punishment is now therefore acceptable.
Right, and the bottom line with that is just that just because someone breaks the law isn't enough. It's just simply not enough because it depends on what the law is. And I do think that a lot of these laws are unjust. And I do think
absolutely, because something being legal doesn't mean that thing is moral, and something being illegal doesn't. Or I prefer actually ethical. Moral tends to have a right-wing religious fanatic connotation to it. The morality clauses and whatnot. But anyway, we obviously know this. The 3/5 compromises in the Constitution. That was not ethical or moral.
Right. I mean, slavery was once legal and it's not ethical. And one may say, oh, well, that's just a false equivalence between slavery and illegal immigration. But obviously, we're not equating that illegal immigration is literally like slavery.
Yeah, we're not.
We're saying
the analogy isn't made to compare that.
Sometimes some of these laws are worth breaking. And for me personally, I don't see illegal immigration as that big of a problem. I think that's an over-exaggerated problem. And I think the best way to solve illegal immigration is to legalize all immigration.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, we haven't even talked about like the drug cartels.
Exactly. If we that's the whole thing. Again, on the right, they don't want to legalize marijuana or any kind of even low-level drug. And it's one of those things like I was mentioning earlier. People are going to do it whether you like it or not. May as well legalize it so that it doesn't have to be underground, so that it doesn't have to be some rando who doesn't know what he's doing, mixing this stuff in his backyard and giving it. And I wouldn't go as far as some libertarians might and say we should completely legalize all drugs. I'm still like, there's a reason that certain drugs are over the counter and some are not. Now, again, I'm not saying all of them are properly classified. Some may have had a lobbyist, and so they're over the counter when they shouldn't, or vice versa. But my point is that the average person isn't qualified to know the side effects of a lot of, let's just stick with prescription medication. And so the stuff that's not over the counter should remain that way. That said, I think we should focus on punishing the companies who get caught selling prescription drugs without a prescription, rather than punishing the people caught with the prescription drugs.
And and that is distantly analogous to the problem, right? Is that the reason why the drug cartels are even alive in the first place is legal drugs. Illegal
drugs.
Illegal drugs. It is because heroin. It is because meth. It's because marijuana are all considered illegal. And really, I would bet my money on this. I really would. If you were to completely decriminalize every single drug, and I mean every single drug, I mean every single one, right?
So you mean decriminalize as opposed to legalize?
Yeah, decriminalize every single drug. And I mean, I'm not even afraid to compromise on this. Sure, legalize heroin, legalize meth, and regulate the safety content of that. But don't regulate it out of existence and essentially push it back to the underground market again, right? But if you were to make all these drugs no longer illegal and not be a crime, I guarantee you the cartels would disappear. But illegal immigration would still exist. Because bottom line is there are still market realities that need to be corrected with an extra more of labor. I mean, that's just the need of the country. America still continues to need more immigrants, right? And like, I'm pretty sure I've encountered like 90% of all the arguments from the conservative side against more immigration, not even open borders, more immigration. And a lot of them are like false dichotomies.
Yeah, they're almost all made up after the fact. They know that they want to justify the belief that they held beforehand, and so just all the excuses they make are transparently fallacious and cherry-picking data and all that sort of stuff.
And some have said like, well, we still have poor people in America, and we still have immigrants on the streets. And it's like, that's a false dichotomy. Take care of people on the streets and let them more immigrant. What's so hard about that? Right? And so, yeah, I do think it's one of the cases where I just think it's really hard for me to just see any argument, a knockdown argument against open borders. The cumulative case for open borders to me is quite overwhelming.
Right. Absolutely. I agree. Well, this is a fascinating conversation. I'm glad we got to cross so many topics, even briefly grazing some topics that weren't even like necessarily in the list of ones that we had to we planned on.
Yeah.
So I actually like kind of enriching the subject matter as far as that goes. But yeah, hopefully we can do another discussion sometime soon. Maybe talk about another few areas. I'd like to talk about climate change, since that's what I've done significant amounts of research on.
Right.